Delenda est Carthago. All right, but apart from the sanitation, the medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, the roads, the freshwater system, and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us? The Punic Wars, Part 7, Romani ite Domum. All right, welcome back to another episode of Flashpoint History. This is going to be a bonus episode on the Punic Wars because, why not? When I look back in that Socratic fashion of self-retrospection, which honestly I think everybody should do at some point, perhaps some more than others, readily coming to mind the upper echelon of our current administration, I thought to myself, what am I going to do with all this information that is now stuck in my head? How many elephants Hannibal managed to cross the Alps with, all 37? How many figs rolled out of Cato's toga when he was whining to the Senate, all 3? And how old was Massinissa when he sired his last child? He was like 86. Wow. So while the information is still fresh in my head and before the short attention span starts to really kick in and I move on to the next topic, I figured I was going to come up with 4 what-if scenarios. 4 situations where if things had gone perhaps a little or a lot differently, how would that have affected the Punic Wars and, for that matter, Western civilization in general? Now, of course, the information that I'm going to be presenting to you is going to be alternative history, and it's going to be based on my sole, humble opinion. But I'd like to think of it as an educated guess based on the research and information that I've obtained over the last year. And if you disagree with what I have to say and you think I'm coming out of complete left field on this one, that's kind of the point. It'd be interesting to hear from people in the audience what you folks would think would have happened if things had gone a little differently. Now, I've posted a couple of these things online, and the responses that I got are absolutely fabulous. It's interesting to see how many people out there are so into this time period. Now, I'm going to spare everybody the usual obligatory plugs that I usually put in at this point. You know where to find the podcast if you need to, but I can't emphasize enough how important it is to spread word about the podcast or rate and review, because that is literally the lifeblood of any podcaster that's out there. And heaven forbid if you find yourself enjoying what you're listening to, well, I feel that rating and reviewing is the perfect form of karma. Either way, enjoy the show. So for the purposes of this particular episode, we need to divide the world into 3 categories of people. Those who absolutely love Monty Python, those who have no idea what Monty Python is and have no idea what I'm talking about, and those who have to grudgingly, and I mean absolutely grudgingly, put up with that first group. Now, for those of you not in the know, Monty Python is a comedy group. They came up with their own TV series way back when. They also had a string of movies, of which I find one particular movie absolutely fascinating called The Life of Brian. Now, if you haven't seen The Life of Brian, it is a movie that was made before everything was politically correct, and it takes a scathingly, and I mean absolutely scathingly satirical view on organized religion, predominantly Christianity. Now, the movie unfolds in the Roman-occupied province of Judea, which is what we would consider today to be the State of Israel. And it centers around a resistance organization known as the Judean People's Front or the People's Front of Judea. I forgot which, but the scene that I want to focus on takes place in their headquarters. The leader of this organization is a man named Reg, and his headquarters, quote-unquote, is basically his living room. And he outlines his plan about how he's going to strike back against the Romans, and then he turns back and looks at all of his minions, who are kind of occupying his living room, and he poses the question, the Romans have stolen everything from us. Not only from us, but they have stolen from our father, and our father's father, and our father's 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 father, and it goes on like this. But then he asks the question, and what have the Romans ever done for us? At which point he folds up his arms and starts bobbing his head up and down with a big grin. This is kind of the same way that Mussolini used to do whenever he felt like he just gave a really good speech to his people. And it's at this point that one of Reg's little men decides to raise up their arm, kind of meekly, and responds with, "Aqueduct?" And you have to hear it in the movie. It comes out almost like a squeak toy. It's like, aqueduct? At which point Reg has to answer that. He said, oh, right. But aside from the aqueducts, what have the Romans ever done for us? And, of course, after he says this, several hands go up, and then it's just like one thing after another. Well, they've given us roads, and medicine, and sanitation, and education, and wine, and safety, and blah, it just goes on and on. What have the Romans indeed done for us? I guess a better question would be, what haven't they done for us? Now, the focus of this episode is to talk about what things would have been like if the Romans weren't on the scene. What if things had gone a little bit differently and the Romans were either diminished or wiped out entirely? I want to emphasize that if you don't have previous knowledge of this time period, or if you haven't listened to the previous episodes, then it may be kind of counterproductive to continue from this point onward, because what I'm going to be talking about is going to come across as an entirely new tier of crazy, and it may be helpful to go back and listen to the previous episodes before you proceed. But with that said, let's get right to it. The first question that we're going to get into is probably the most absurd. It revolves around the idea of what if the Punic Wars never happened, but instead, Rome and Carthage managed to figure out some sort of working relationship that evolved into an alliance where they became both economically and militarily codependent. I know what you're thinking here. If this sounds strange, it's because it's completely bizarro. Rome and Carthage, after all, were kind of like oil and water. In broad terms, their political and social ideologies were completely juxtaposed to one another. I mean, and again, we're talking about in completely broad terms here, so it's not exactly precise, but Carthage, after all, was a seafaring, mercantile empire that believed in the whole concept of capitalism, and when it came to fighting, that was, well, it was kind of bad for business, so they would outsource that to mercenaries, because after all that blood and sinew and all that icky stuff would just kind of get in the way of making a buck. As compared to the Romans, well, for the Romans, their entire society, and again in broad terms, was based up on the concept of military conquest and fighting. In fact, in Rome, the whole idea was that a person had to be both a citizen and a soldier. It was all about duty and honor and loyalty to the state. I mean, they were the proverbial Klingons of the 3rd century. So how on earth could an alliance like this possibly have come to have been? Well, the way I figure it would have happened was if Pyrrhus would have been, perhaps, a little bit more successful than he was. If you recall, Pyrrhus was a king of a portion of northwestern Greece known as Epirus. He came to power in 297 BCE, and he was the second cousin of this guy named Alexander. You might have heard of him. He's also known as Alexander the Great, who went off and did this thing by attacking the world's largest land empire, the Persians, took it out, and then proceeded to, well, conquer the known world. And when you come from a family like that, if you don't conquer something, you're going to come across as a total schmuck. But in 282, Pyrrhus got the opportunity that he was looking for. Rome at this point was starting to encroach on a lot of the Greek city-states in southern Italy, an area known as Magna Graecia, and one of these city-states in particular, a city-state known as Tarentum, began calling out for help. And Pyrrhus, coming to the aid of his countrymen, at least that's what he called it, managed to pack up his elite fighting force, cross the Adriatic, and take on the Romans. Now, our boy was actually pretty darn good when it came to tactical military maneuvers. He met up with the Romans at a place called Heraclea in 280, and he sent in his elephants in this flanking maneuver that hit the Romans on their side, and the Romans, who had never seen an elephant before, were freaked out and were quickly routed. Pyrrhus, being the good military general that he was, pressed the offensive and came within a 2-day march on the capital city. Now, the very next year, he took on the Romans again at a place called Asculum. And again, he'd sent in his elephants in a flanking maneuver, but this time, the Romans managed to inflict severe, and I mean absolutely horrendous losses on his forces. The Battle of Asculum is where the term Pyrrhic victory comes from. This is the type of victory where, even though you won the battle, your forces are so badly mauled that there's nothing else you can do and you're probably going to end up losing the war. talk about your all-time backfires. Your second cousin is going to go down, remembered as the man who conquered the world, and you are going to be remembered by history for this. Well, our boy was not going to be somebody that was going to be inundated by any type of setback like that. He took the remainder of his forces, went down into southern Italy, after getting bored with the Romans, crossed over into Sicily, and then decided to take on the Carthaginians and managed to push them back as well. And you have to admit, for one man to be able to take on both the Romans and the Carthaginians, that's kind of impressive. However, nobody's winning streak is going to last forever, and Pyrrhus was going to be no different. While the Romans and the Carthaginians could rebuild their forces, he really couldn't, and he began to rely on these Greek city-states that he had just quote-unquote liberated to get things like money and troops and supplies and food, and they were only willing to put up with it for so long because the Greek city-states quickly realized that they weren't so much liberated as conquered, and then they began to rebel against him. But of course, at this point, the megalomania had really set in, and Pyrrhus's response was to establish this kind of tyrannical rule which only exacerbated his own downfall. In the end, he had to pull back out of Sicily. He went back into Italy, where he took on the Romans yet again at a place called Beneventum, but this time his elephants didn't work. In the immortal words of Arnold Schwarzenegger, if it bleeds, you can kill it, the Romans figured out that if you throw enough javelins at the pachyderms, you can take them out. And at that point, Pyrrhus realized that he was kind of done. As he was packing up his troops on the boats to take them back across the Adriatic back to his homeland in Greece, he looked back one last time and was remembered as saying the dramatic words, "My friends, what a field for the Carthaginians and the Romans we are leaving behind us," foreshadowing the idea that a war was going to happen. And, of course, that was exactly what came to pass. All that was needed was some sort of minor instigating event to set the whole thing off, and that's exactly what you got with the Mamertines in Messina. Now, if it wasn't for the Mamertines putting the Romans and the Carthaginians on their final destination toward direct confrontation, it probably would have been something else. But we know how this timeline plays out. You have 3 major confrontations, Carthage coming close to victory, at least in the first 2, but not quite able to achieve it. And then, of course, the 3 main points that everyone remembers from the Punic Wars: Hannibal, Alps, elephants. And then in the end, Carthage goes down in flames, and then there's salt everywhere. But supposing things had gone just a little differently, let's go back to the Battle of Asculum and say that on that day, Pyrrhus didn't win himself a Pyrrhic victory, but instead he managed to wipe the Romans out, and with his intact army, he presses the offensive. Of course, that's what, megalomaniacs do, especially ones that have huge chips on their shoulders. And he finds himself another Roman army, say in front of the gates of Rome, and defeats it again. The Romans would have had to fall back. I mean, what else can you do at this point? But at least they had city walls to hide behind. If you recall, in 390, a bunch of Gauls came down from the north, sacked the city, and the Romans, learning from their mistakes the hard way, as always, decided to build a series of fortifications around the city. Now, siege technology being what it was at the time, I doubt Pyrrhus would have been able to go any further, but think about the ramifications that this would have had on the political landscape of Italy. There's a Roman proverb out there. It goes, Deus forteribus adesse, which means the gods are on the side of the stronger. And this is what the Romans would say to themselves. This is what they would chant as they slowly expanded across Italy. But if you think about it, the statement is also a two-edged sword. The predominant political structure in central and southern Italy at the time was the city-state. And a lot of these were either suppressed or threatened or attacked by Rome. A lot of them would rise up in revolt, especially the Greek colonies in southern Italy known as Magna Graecia. And it would be this group that, seeing a fellow Greek, i.e. Pyrrhus, thrashing the Romans, they naturally would have come over to his side. Perhaps not all of them, but they would have lended more and more support. And this would be kind of a snowball effect. Once one person was doing it, then it would be kind of monkey see, monkey do. And before you know it, Pyrrhus would have a massive contingent of force under his power. Pyrrhus would most likely not have stopped with just Rome. Like many would-be conquerors in history, once you get a slice of the pie, you just can't stop. You have to keep going. Now, with his force, he might have stuck around in Italy for a little bit longer, but seeing other prizes in Sicily, he probably would have crossed over the Straits of Messina, attacked into Sicily, and now with a bigger force, well supplied by the colonies of southern Italy, and with his veterans intact, I'm sure he probably would have cleaned the entire island of Sicily of all Carthaginian influence. And just like in the normal timeline, Pyrrhus already had plans in play to invade North Africa, but this time I think he would have been just a little bit more successful. I would even go so far as to wager that with his luck and his tactical ability, he might have pushed the Carthaginians back to their city gates just like he had done with the Romans. But like I've said before, on a long enough timeline, everybody's winning streak is eventually gonna fail. And Pyrrhus was dealing with not just one, but two extremely resilient and vibrant cultures. Rome and Carthage were to antiquity what Winston Churchill was during the Second World War when he gave his speech to the House of Commons. He said, "We shall defend our island whatever the costs may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." And I think that this would have been the philosophy that Rome would have adopted right off the bat. Carthage may have tried to, buy her way out of a situation, but in the end, I think that you can only push Carthage so much before she would be willing to really fight back. It goes without saying that there is a recurring motif in history that your enemy's enemy has the potential to be your friend. And if you have a mutual opponent that is doing really well and turns out to be a complete and total douchebag in the process, well, that brings together otherwise oil and water countries like no other force. And of course, this is nothing new. This is a common thing that you see throughout history. You get a Napoleon Bonaparte, and then suddenly half of Europe is allied against him. You get an Adolf Hitler, and you have countries like the United States, England, and the Soviet Union suddenly on the same side. I don't think people realize how bizarre it is to see pictures of FDR and Stalin and Churchill sitting at a table drinking and toasting and talking about diplomatic policy. It's a very strange thing, and if you had asked anybody before the Second World War that this would have happened, they would have thought you were nuts. Now, going back to our alternative history, I could see Rome and Carthage really struggling here, and if they hadn't have formed an alliance right off the bat, it might have been kind of more or less a non-aggression pact. Now, even in the standard timeline, there's evidence to suggest that Rome and Carthage actually had something like this, because, ironically enough, before the Punic Wars broke out, both Rome and Carthage thought of Pyrrhus as being the greater enemy. All right, let's make the assumption that both Rome and Carthage managed to survive Pyrrhus's onslaught. And I don't think it's that far cry of a statement to make, because if you look at the fortifications of both Rome and Carthage, it was well above and beyond the siege technology of the time, which also implies that Pyrrhus, despite all of his military expertise and his prowess on the battlefield and his massive army and all the Greek colonies that were supplying him with troops and supplies, etc., which I think at this point he probably would have had to enslave most of them in order to persecute the war. Despite all that, his ability to press the offensive would have come to a halt. And as the old statement goes, friends come and go, but enemies persist for life. I think at this point, the reconquest would have begun. This reconquest would have been, without doubt, a Herculean task for both Rome and for Carthage. Rome probably would have gotten to work right away, reestablishing her control over central Italy and kind of reasserting her dominance, her hegemony, if you will, over the Latin city-states in the area. Whereas Carthage, I think, would have had a really difficult time in the sense that she would have had to hire a bunch of mercenaries in order to fight for her, because that was Carthage's modus operandi. That's the way she worked. She was the rich kid on the block and could afford to outsource her foreign military needs to other people. And under the circumstances, keep in mind we're not following the standard timeline. We're in a situation where both Carthage and Rome have their backs proverbially to the wall. And in that type of situation, I don't think it's that much of a stretch of the imagination to consider the idea that Carthage might have started to hire Roman troops in order to fight for her. Before everyone says no to this concept, consider the idea that the Roman army was extremely well-disciplined, for the most part well-led, and had a good reputation for fighting, the ideal type of mercenary that the Carthaginian Senate would have looked for. And Rome, well, I think at this point Rome really could have used the money, and despite all of that, Rome and Carthage had a common foe. Which, of course, also begs the question, well, how are Roman troops going to get down to North Africa or Sicily or Sardinia to do any type of fighting? Well, Carthage had an unrivaled navy. And even in the standard timeline, Rome had a navy at some point in order to ferry its troops around. Okay, so I kind of agree with you. It does sound a little strange, and it's kind of a massive assumption to make, but supposing this working relationship worked out. Well, in that situation, I think it would have been only a matter of time between the combined forces of Rome's army and Carthage's navy that the Greeks would have been kicked out altogether. But Pyrrhus probably would have gone down in the history books as like Pyrrhus the Great or Pyrrhus the Conqueror instead of Pyrrhus, the father of the Pyrrhic victory. And what's to be said about Rome and Carthage after the war ended? I would say that as soon as Pyrrhus was out of the picture, they probably would have gone to war, but supposing even that didn't happen. Again, I know, another major assumption. Supposing that didn't happen. Well, I think in that type of situation, allies that have fought in a major confrontation have a tendency to learn from one another and develop a somewhat meaningful coexistence. I think Carthage would have picked up on the idea from its Roman neighbor that it's good to have a standing army instead of just hiring mercenaries, and that expansion is sometimes a necessary aspect of a growing civilization. Whereas the Romans might have picked up on the idea that trade and having a navy is essential, and sometimes it's also important to have colonies. It's really hard to say what would have happened at this point, but I could imagine that if Carthage and Rome weren't trying to kill each other as soon as Pyrrhus was out of the picture, then perhaps the Mediterranean would have served as some sort of buffer zone. Rome would have expanded into all of Italy, gone into Gaul, maybe moved into a portion of Spain, and at the same time would have gone after Pyrrhus's homeland in Greece, moving all the way up to the edge of Asia Minor. Whereas the Carthaginians, learning from their aggressive northern neighbors, would have probably taken out the rest of North Africa, moving in on Ptolemaic Egypt, taken out a portion of Spain, and then perhaps, in a sense of manifest destiny, would have tried to recapture its homeland in Tyre, which is in Syria. The situation that I'm describing, a political map where Rome basically owns a big chunk of Europe, and Carthage owns most of North Africa, parts of Spain, and the Middle East. Well, I mean, it's not exactly stable. But you would have two very massive empires that are just next to one another, and if there was a war that would have broken out, well, that war probably would have made the Punic Wars look like nothing in comparison. Can you imagine the amount of resources, the cities that are involved, the armies that were moving, navies clashing with one another? I mean, this would have been a truly titanic clash. Okay, so why don't we just keep moving on? Because I get it, that question is a little absurd, and in the end, getting Carthage and Rome to play nice with one another is like putting toothpaste back in the tube, and when it comes down to it, we're never going to really know. However, that said, I do want to point out that absurd questions like this make excellent thought experiments because when it comes to international politics, despite what certain presidents will tell you, it's such a complex and changing and dynamic entity that you never really know how to predict what's going to happen next. I mean, look at the relationship between the United States, Japan, and China in 1945, and then compare the three like 15, 20, and then 30 years later. It's a complete 180 shift. So, moving on. Our next question is, what if Hannibal, after the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, decided to march directly on Rome? I want to give everybody just a little bit of background history at this time, just to get everybody caught up, and especially for those out there who have not had a chance to listen to the previous podcasts. So we're going to be moving through the First Punic War, which Carthage ends up losing, and then Carthage has to deal with a revolt of its own army known as the Mercenary Wars. It's during the Mercenary Wars that an undefeated Carthaginian general by the name of Hamilcar Barca comes to prominence. And they call him Barca, by the way, because it means lightning, because he's just that good when it comes to any type of tactical military maneuvering. In any case, he puts down the rebellion, and then he gets completely fed up with the upper echelon of Carthaginian society because to call them thankless would have been a bit of an understatement. He packs up all of his belongings, his army, his followers, and most importantly, his son, Hannibal, and decides to cross the Mediterranean and found a new colony in Spain in order to exploit the silver mines that are there. Now, I don't know about you, but this just reeks of historical irony. I mean, for Carthage, being the Old World, to cross the Great Sea, being the Mediterranean, and found a colony in what it considers to be the New World of Spain in order to enslave the local population and force them into mining silver, well, that's just kind of foreshadowing of what Spain's going to be doing 1,800 years later. Okay, but I'm kind of digressing. Let's get back to the story. Hamilcar Barca decides to found a new colony in Spain, which he calls, for lack of imagination, New Carthage, and it does really well. He expands Carthaginian influence in Spain, but then in 228, he dies. So a few years later, his son Hannibal takes over command. And Hannibal, even as a child, was sworn to be an enemy of Rome, and it's a vow that he takes very seriously. Hannibal immediately starts making preparations, and then, once his army is ready, he launches an attack against a Roman allied city in Spain known as Saguntum. In 218, he manages to capture the city, which of course pisses off the Romans to no end. They send a delegation to the original city of Carthage, demanding Hannibal's head on a platter and the return of his army. To which the Carthaginian Senate responds, you know what, we'd rather kiss an elephant, which only angers the Romans even more. They declare war, and the Second Punic War is now off and running. Hannibal's military campaign between 218 and 216 BCE is arguably one of the most impressive and imaginative and celebrated military campaigns in human history. He takes his entire army, crosses over the Pyrenees, enters into Gaul, crosses the massive Rhone River only to take on a Gallic barbarian army on the other side, and then in his immortal words, I shall either find a way or make one. He does what nobody expects him to do. In the middle of winter, he crosses over the Alps with his entire army and his elephants. But crossing the Alps for a man like Hannibal, in the middle of winter, is just kind of like a warm-up. Once he arrives in Italy, the Romans throw everything they have at him, but the guy is just unstoppable. And his list of victories is just so impressive. He takes on a Roman army at the river Ticinus, where he wipes it out and nearly kills the Roman consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, the father of the soon-to-be Scipio Africanus. About a month later, he manages to take on another Roman army as it's crossing the river Trebia, and this time he manages to almost encircle the entire army, inflicting massive casualties. The few survivors that got out of this managed to escape by the skin of their teeth. Now, the very next year, in 217, Hannibal manages to lure another Roman legion and its hot-headed commander into arguably one of the greatest ambushes in history. He manages to wipe out the legion, killing himself a consul in the process, on the shores of a place known as Lake Trasimene. Now, the Roman response to this is to build a bigger and badder army, twice the size of anything that it's ever fielded before, and place both of its consuls in charge. And while this is going on, Hannibal finds himself a nice little quiet corner in southern Italy, known as Cannae, and waits for the Romans to bring it on. August 2nd of the year 216 is a date that will be forever stained in Roman history. It's on this day that the Roman consuls decided to rush in where angels fear to tread. They walked right into Hannibal's trap. Cannae is considered by a lot of historians to be the perfect battle. It's a situation where you had a smaller army taking on a larger army, managed to completely encircle the army, and then annihilate it. As I had mentioned in my previous podcast, the number of casualties, the actual number of deaths that Hannibal and his army inflicted on the Romans on that day was equivalent to what you would see in a nuclear explosion. And yes, I'm talking about Hiroshima here. If you look back, there's not very many civilizations in history that can take on defeat after defeat after defeat after massive defeat like this and still keep going. Hannibal had the option now to march on Rome. In fact, he was approached by his cavalry commander, Hannibal, who was extremely enthusiastic about the idea. He told him, he said, hey, you know what? The horses are ready, the men are ready. In 5 days, we can be in Rome. Which, of course, is not true. It probably would have taken him 2 weeks. But, if you're trying to sell an idea to the boss, you might want to use a little bit of hyperbole. In any case, Hannibal turned him down. To which Hannibal responded almost in a scolding way, Hannibal, you know how to win a victory, but you don't know how to use one. And again, we know how that one kind of played out. But let's go to alternative history here. Let's say that Hannibal looked down after listening to his commander's words and then looked up with his one good eye, surveying the field of battle that he had just come through, where it was estimated that there was approximately 6.5 million pounds of human flesh rotting in the sun. And he thought to himself, hey, you know what? Why stop here? At which point, he decided to press the offensive. Now, the Roman survivors of Cannae, all about 10,000 of them strong, ended up taking up refuge in the nearby city of Canusium. These are the same men that Robert O'Connell, in his book by the very same name, would refer to them as the ghosts of Cannae. He called them this because these men would soon be exiled by the Roman Senate to the island of Sicily, where they would sit, forgotten, for over a decade until Scipio Africanus came along and decided to reincorporate them into the Roman legions. It was these very same men that would get themselves a rematch against Hannibal's legions at the Battle of Zama. They were instrumental in Hannibal's defeat. Now, as Hannibal and his army in our alternative history were on the march, they would have gone right through Canusium and wiped these men out. And amongst them was Scipio Africanus himself. When I posted this question online, what would have happened if Hannibal had marched on Rome right then and there? The answers were overwhelmingly that he couldn't have taken the city. It's impossible. Forget it. And you know what? I kind of agree with that. Hannibal's army was a fast, efficient, lean, elite army designed to take out enemy forces on the field. It wasn't designed for siege warfare, not to mention the fact that siege technology completely sucked. I mean, if you looked at it, it took him 8 months just to take Saguntum. His army wasn't even big enough to surround the city of Rome. So the way that I figure his march on Rome would have worked out would have been 2 diametrically opposite outcomes. I'd have to say that the first outcome would have been that Hannibal's presence at the gates of Rome would have had enough of a psychological impact that it would have shattered Roman hegemony. Now, if you think about it, in the standard timeline, the victory at Cannae had already sent shockwaves through the Roman world. You had an uprising in Sardinia. Sicily and Syracuse were breaking away. There was a revolt of barbarians up in the north in the Po Valley, and Philip V of Macedonia had decided to come in on the side of Hannibal. Even the second largest city in Italy, Capua, had defected to the Carthaginian side. Now, if you add Hannibal's presence right then and there, that may have been enough to disrupt that core group of city-states, the Latin Confederation that Rome desperately needed at this point in order to supply manpower and material in order to rebuild its army. So even if a handful of those city-states managed to either break away or, even worse, defect to the Carthaginian side, Rome would have been very hard-pressed in order to rebuild her army. And it would have been very difficult to say if she would have ever been able to regain the initiative. What's more, this kind of victory might have been just what Hannibal needed in order to convince his own government to bring in even more reinforcements. And if that had happened, then Rome really would have been in dire straits. Now, what's to say would have happened next? Rome might have been reverted to kind of a rump state. It might have fought on, who knows? But I think that Carthage would have played a much more prominent role from that point onward. Now, this of the two scenarios that I had described plays out kind of like a parkour video on YouTube. And for those of you who are not familiar with parkour, it's the urban gymnastics where you have a person that goes from point A to point B in the most creative way they can come up with, jumping over stuff, dodging through stuff, doing a lot of somersaults. And that's what Hannibal would have had to have done with his army in order to accomplish this. He had victory after victory after victory after Cannae, and then he would have had to deftly maneuver his quick-moving army to the right place at the right time. But for those of you who have ever watched parkour, you know that for every successful video out there, there is also a parkour fail video. And in those situations, you have people doing somersaults and then doing a faceplant directly into a concrete pylon. And that is the other option that could have occurred for Hannibal and his army. After making a forced march and getting to the gates of Rome, he would have set up camp, and then the Romans would have done nothing. They would have stared at him. Granted, there would probably have been a lot of panic in the streets, but in the end, the Roman Senate would have realized really quickly that their walls are impregnable, and Hannibal has no way of getting in. Now, this would have put Hannibal in a very difficult situation. He would have had a depleted, exhausted army that, of course, also had taken casualties after Cannae, and he would have found himself surrounded. What's worse, if none of the city-states that Rome relied on defected to his side, then procuring more supplies would have been very difficult for him, and while he was sitting there, Rome and her allies would be busy rebuilding. Eventually, Hannibal would have had to retreat. He would have had to try to find supplies somewhere, and he would have lost face as he was moving away from the city. And if the Romans were really up for the task and they found themselves a general crazy enough to do it, they might have actually sent an army to pursue and track down this depleted Punic force. And that would have been a disaster. I would have to say that all the great generals in history always try to do that long shot. It's what makes them great. It's why we celebrate Robert E. Lee's flanking maneuver at Chancellorsville. It's why we remember Caesar crossing the Rubicon. The die is cast. It's what makes us still remember Napoleon, even though he tried to take on two armies at Waterloo. And when it works, it's amazing. And when it doesn't, well, I think the reason why Hannibal didn't press the offensive and march on Rome is because he realized that it was too long of a shot. All right, let's move along to our next topic. The next question is, what if the Carthaginians were able to kick the Romans off of Sicily in the Second Punic War and then combined Archimedes' genius and ability to develop siege warfare with Hannibal's tactical skills? I picked out this question because I absolutely love scenarios that involve some sort of anachronistic history. There's a movie out there called The Final Countdown. It's a really cheesy one. It came out a really long time ago, and it centers around the idea of a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier with all of its jets and helicopters, and don't forget about the nukes, going through some sort of space-time rift, and then appearing off the island of Hawaii on December 6th, 1941, which is the day before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The movie centers around the idea of what would have happened if you had an American aircraft carrier with that kind of technology and that kind of firepower fighting in the Second World War. Well, duh. In the Second Punic War, you actually had a real-life anachronism. The city of Syracuse had been an ally to Rome since the First Punic War. That is, of course, up until the point when its king died, and a pro-Carthaginian faction managed to sneak into the city, usurp the government, and establish it as a Carthaginian stronghold. The Roman Republic responded by sending a consul by the name of Marcellus in order to retake the city, but inside there was a man by the name of Archimedes who came up with defensive mechanisms that were literally hundreds of years ahead of its time. So I managed to tap into some resources. I met a fellow podcaster by the name of Ryan Stitt, who is an expert on ancient Greek history, here to give us a little bit of a rundown on Archimedes. Ryan, take it away.
Hello, and I'm Ryan Stitt from the History of Ancient Greece podcast, here to give you a little background info on Archimedes. Born around 287 BC, Archimedes was a distant relative to the Syracusan king, Hieron II. And so, in his youth, he was afforded the opportunity to travel across the Mediterranean to Alexandria in Egypt, where he studied mathematics with the successors of Euclid. He then returned to Syracuse, where he spent the rest of his life. While there, he invented many engineering feats, at first in the benefit of his home city, and later to the benefit of mankind. Particularly, the so-called Archimedes Screw, a cylindrical tube with a revolving screw-shaped blade inside that when turned constantly, either by hand or by machine, would lift water uphill. A highly impressive feat in the ancient world because up until then, aqueducts could only bring water downhill. The Roman architect Vitruvius says that it was an improvement on a screw pump that was used to irrigate the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon, some 3 centuries earlier. Plutarch also describes how he designed the block and tackle pulley system that allowed sailors to use the principle of leverage to lift objects that would have otherwise been too heavy to move. While he did not invent the lever, he wrote a treatise on it, in which he gives the famous line, quote, "Give me a place to stand on, and I will move the earth." End quote. It's clear that he understood concepts of physics and engineering far advanced for his day. His most famous discovery, or at least the most well-known to this day, was his Eureka moment. While trying to figure out how to measure the volume of an irregular object, he jumped into a bath, where he observed that the water level rose, and so he realized that the amount of water displaced was equal to the volume of the object submerged in the water. And so, finally solving his problem, he jumped up and ran naked through the streets, so excited by his discovery that he had forgotten to dress, shouting Eureka, or Greek for "I have found it." At the age of 73, in 214 BC, Archimedes found himself as the linchpin of holding Syracuse's defenses together when the Romans came upon them during the Second Punic War. When the Roman general Marcellus laid siege to the city by both land and sea, the walls were attacked with a volley of missiles. In response, Archimedes used a catapult of his own design to take down both the Roman ships in their harbor and the Roman infantry at their walls. He also designed little tubes along the walls from which the Syracusans could fire missiles themselves without being hit by the Romans. The Roman infantry thus fell back to evade the reach of both of their missiles and their catapults. When the Roman fleet thus moved closer to get out of the range of the catapults, Archimedes implemented his infamous claw, which consisted of a beam built across the wall from inside the city to the sea, at the end of which was a heavy chain attached to a large metal grappling hook that would grab the ships, lift them out of the water and into the air, and then release them, smashing them into the water and thus destroying and sinking them. In addition, Archimedes was said to have used a series of mirrors, acting collectively as a parabolic reflector, to burn single Roman ships. This tactic, known as Archimedes' death ray, was used to focus sunlight onto approaching ships, causing them to catch fire. Modern scientists have concluded that a more likely effect of the mirrors would have been blinding or distracting the crew of the ship. It's far more likely that flaming arrows or fireballs sent from the catapults would have been used to set a ship ablaze. It's probable that these methods were used in conjunction to cause terror amongst the Roman fleet. The result was that the siege became bogged down to a stalemate for the next 2 years. Finally, in 212 BC, after successfully defending themselves for 2 years using Archimedes' inventions, Syracuse fell when pro-Roman nobles betrayed their city and threw open the gates, and the whole army rushed in. According to Plutarch, Archimedes was contemplating a mathematical diagram when the city was captured. When a Roman soldier commanded him to come and meet Marcellus, he declined, saying that he had to finish working on the problem. The soldier was so enraged by this that he slew Archimedes with his sword. Marcellus was reportedly angered by the death of the 75-year-old Archimedes, as he considered him a valuable scientific asset and had ordered that he not be harmed. No doubt he wanted to use his great mind for the benefit of the Roman Republic. While Archimedes is often regarded as having a brilliant mind for engineering, he also made many contributions to the field of mathematics and is considered by many as one of, if not the greatest, mathematician in antiquity. He applied concepts of the infinite and strove to prove a range of geometrical theorems, including the area of a circle, the surface area and volume of a sphere, and the area under a parabola. He also derived an accurate approximation of pi, defined mathematically a spiral, and created a system using exponents for large numbers. He made his work known through correspondence with the mathematicians back in Alexandria. Some of these letters were collected and preserved during the Byzantine period. They were brought to a wider audience when they were translated into Arabic and Latin and dispersed east and west. These letters, along with what was written about him by Polybius, Livy, Cicero, Vitruvius, and Plutarch, among others, were an influential source of ideas for scientists during the Renaissance. And for that, he was among those who laid the foundations for the scientific revolution of the early modern period. And so that was a brief overview of Archimedes. Now to turn you back to your regularly scheduled programming. Take it away, Nitin.
So, as Ryan has so eloquently put it, Archimedes wasn't just profound for antiquity. The man was profound for humanity as a whole. And the Romans knew this. They really wanted to get their hands on the guy. Now, while this siege was dragging on, the Carthaginian high command actually sent a relief force to the island. Of course, in the real timeline, the Romans picked up on this force coming in, they moved to intercept, and then basically wiped them out. But let's suppose things had gone just a little differently. Supposing this force landed at Agrigenta, moved down the coast, and managed to catch the Romans by surprise, pushing them back and relieving the siege of Syracuse. Now, if this had happened, and the Carthaginians were able to gain a much firmer control of the island, they would have been able to use Syracuse as a base of operations to push the Romans back further. And what's more, if that was possible, then supplies and reinforcements might have actually been able to move to the mainland of Italy itself. This really begs the question that if this corridor was established, and you had troops and supplies and whatnot going back and forth, how long would it have taken for Archimedes' exploits to get to Hannibal? I'd like to think of Hannibal as being kind of an out-of-box thinker. And kind of along the same lines as Genghis Khan, he could recognize military skill. And even if it comes in the form of your enemy, you know how to integrate that into your own fighting force. I'd like to think of Hannibal as recognizing a good thing when he saw one. And in this situation, I think he would have looked over at Archimedes and said, hey, you know what? I'd like you to design me something. I want you to get me inside of a Roman city. Archimedes had already proven himself to be the go-to man when it came to the defense of a city. I think he probably would have been just as good on the offense. This was a man who came up with things like ballistas and catapults. And mind you, these weren't tiny little catapults we're talking about here. We're talking about massive trebuchet kind of catapults, the kind of thing that you're not going to see until the time of the Crusades, the kind of instruments that can throw a rock or a boulder against the city wall and bash it down. And along those same lines, I think it would have been child's play for a mind like that of Archimedes to come up with things like siege towers and battering rams. And yes, these are the type of things that get you inside of a Roman city. So with that in mind, I think it is definitively time for another thought experiment. Let's replay the latter portion of the Second Punic War, but this time things are a little different. Now just remember that after the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal and his army were on Italian soil for over a decade. Now I want you to take Hannibal's impressive, tactical, masterful ability to wipe out Roman army after Roman army on the field of battle, and now combine that with his ability to get inside of Roman strongholds. Suddenly, the strategic map is now completely different. All of those little points that represented Roman cities and fortifications are no longer insurmountable objectives or obstacles. They're now targets of opportunity. Well, I'm going to leave the rest of this scenario up to your imagination because I think under these new circumstances, the term Roman massacre would have to be redefined. Okay, so with that depressing comment behind, why don't we move on to our next and final question in the what-if scenarios. In this one we ask, what if Hasdrubal, who was Hannibal's brother, managed to win at the Battle of Metaurus? In my previous podcast, I had mentioned that when Hannibal had left to storm the Roman castle, he left behind Hasdrubal in charge of their operations in Spain. Hasdrubal was, he tried hard. Let's give him that, right? He gets an A for effort. But when it came to tactical ability, he wasn't the best. He was pushed back by the Scipios, and then at the Battle of Baecula, despite the fact that he had the high ground and a fortified entrenchment at the top of the hill, Scipio Africanus broke up his army into two forces and managed to flank him and push him off. Now, Hasdrubal escaped with the bulk of his army, and like his brother, he managed to cross the Alps and descend into Italy. Unfortunately, when he got there, he was intercepted by General Nero, who managed to do a flanking maneuver and destroy him at the Battle of Metaurus, at which point he got his head chopped off, and that was thrown into Hannibal's camp a few days later. Kind of a depressing way to go. But let's suppose things had gone just a little differently. The Battle of Metaurus in 207 was not a foregone conclusion that it was going to be a Roman victory. In fact, the Roman general Nero, who engaged Hasdrubal, took a massive risk. Nero, at this point in time, was doing guard duty over Hannibal's army in southern Italy. And when he discovered that Hannibal's brother had crossed over the Alps, he basically stripped his line down to a skeletal force, which he left in front of Hannibal's camp as kind of a subterfuge. And then he took the rest of his Roman soldiers and force-marched them to the north. When both sides finally engaged one another, the Carthaginians were actually winning. They were pressing against the Roman left flank, and it was beginning to crumble. Nero had to pull off some really fancy maneuvering. He took his right wing, which wasn't doing anything, marched it completely around the back of his own army, and threw it into his left flank, which managed to not only stabilize that side, but he managed to actually flank the Carthaginians. And then at that point, it was the Punic forces that got demolished. Okay, let's say that Hasdrubal is too adorable to wipe out at this point. Let's rewrite history. Let's say that during that battle, Hasdrubal looks up, realizes that he's being outflanked, decides to maneuver forces from one flank to another, push off the Roman attack, and then counterattack the Roman center, destroying it. Or even worse, Hannibal, deep in the south, discovers that Nero is now somehow missing, and then goes off in pursuit. Can you imagine what would have happened to that Roman army if it discovered itself being sandwiched between Hannibal's forces on one side and his brother's forces on the other? It would have gotten smashed. So what would have happened at this point? Well, I think the two forces would have combined into one giant Carthaginian super army. Hannibal would have probably naturally taken over command. He would have probably patted his brother on the head and said, "Hey, you know what? I got this now." There is some historical evidence out there that when Hasdrubal crossed over the Alps, he brought some siege equipment with him. And so, when I posted this question online, the responses I got were that, with this massive army and that siege equipment, that Carthaginian force would have run amok. It might have even taken out a couple of Roman strongholds and possibly even gone after Rome. Sure. Anything is a possibility, especially when you're dealing with somebody like Hannibal. He had a very dynamic mind. After all, if you look at the Battle of Cannae on paper, the chances of a Carthaginian victory were very small, and yet he managed to pull it off. And I think he's the type of person that would have exploited any type of Roman weakness when he found it. But in the grand scheme of things, at this point in the Second Punic War, the war was definitively going towards the Romans. I think the way that this most likely would have played out would be that this Carthaginian megaforce probably would have done a just crudload of damage. Now, they probably would have gotten into a couple of Roman cities, they would most definitively have prolonged the war, and if they had inflicted enough pain, they might have convinced the Roman Senate not to invade North Africa. But I think, in the end, the Roman resolve, her intense need to continue the fight, would most likely have prevailed. But again, no one can really say for sure. Alright, so that ends our what-if scenarios. In each one of these, we talked about what would have happened if the Punic Wars had gone differently, and I've kind of alluded to the idea that Rome probably wouldn't have achieved the same level of prominence in Western civilization that she actually did. So how would that have affected Western civilization? Because if you don't have a Roman Republic, you're not going to have a Roman Empire. And without a Roman Empire, would you have a rise of Christianity? Would you have an Eastern Roman Empire? And towards that end, would you have a Constantinople? Along those same lines, I guess it's worthwhile to ask, what would have happened when the Vandals and the Ostrogoths and the Huns came through in the 4th and 5th century? Who would have slowed them down? And then, looking forward in time, how would this have affected the Islamic conquest of the 7th and 8th century? Where would all the knowledge of Western civilization be if it wasn't for the Byzantine Empire? Would there have ever been a crusading time period? And when it comes to the rise of the Ottomans, who would have stopped them, or at least slowed them down from the conquest of Europe if it wasn't for Constantinople? Now, going back for a second, what is to be said about Carthage if she survived? Would she actually have learned to expand throughout the Mediterranean? Would North Africa end up colonizing Europe? Would her ships venture out into the Atlantic and initiate the age of discovery of the New World in like the 5th or 6th century? Well, as you can imagine, those questions are way beyond the context of a single podcast episode. I'm going to kind of leave you to ponder them. If you come up with any good responses, by all means, let me know. The bottom line, folks, is that the Romans have had a profound impact on all of us. It's as they say, you can't escape history. And this is an excellent point to remember if you ever find yourself in the unlikely situation of asking the question, what have the Romans ever done for us? Well, that brings this episode to a close, and along those same lines, it brings the entire Punic Wars series to an end. I hope everybody out there enjoyed the series as much as I had fun making it. Now, going forward, we're going to be leaving the Romans and the Carthaginians behind and traveling approximately 1,800 years into the future to the Age of Exploration, where we discover just how long it takes for humans to set aside that sense of awe and discovery and replace it with things like exploitation and slavery and just full-blown armed conflict. So join us next time on Flashpoint History for our next series, which will be titled The War of the Worlds. In the meantime, I'd like to thank everybody for your time and for listening. If you get a chance, please rate and review.